to think about chronic sinusitis not responding to the usual medication treatment with nasal crusting, we have to suspect a Wagner's granulomatous as a DD in this patient. On examination with ulceration of the nasal mucosa, we can see, and the nasal crusting and septal perforation are seen on normal scopy. And nasal endoscopy, it shows a purulent discharge in the middle meatus and crusting over the septum and turbinates. Rarely nasal polyps may be seen on the endoscopy. Saddle nose deformity and nasal airway stenosis are also seen. And the saddle nose deformity, which is seen in 10 to 25% of the patients. And subglottic stenosis is a rare complication, but manifests as a hoarseness of voice and stridor. In mostly, it is presented in the generalized vagus granulomatosis. Airway involvement is more common in young patients and less than 30 years and females. Mostly subglottic stenosis are seen in this age of the patient.
Ravi, one important point is
Yes, sir.
children with Wegener's can present with silent subglottic stenosis. You have written there, no? It is more common
Yes,
in
sir.
young. It means pediatric actually. Okay. So
Okay, sir.
the rate of subglottic stenosis is higher. If you compare the clinical presentation of adult versus pediatric Wegener's, subglottic stenosis is higher in children compared to adults.
Coming to the oral cavity, involvement is seen in less than 6% of the patients. It may present as a strawberry gingivitis, reddish to pinkish hyperplastic gingivitis with a numerous petechial associated with pain and bleeding gums. Mucosal ulcers over the tongue, buccal mucosa, and gums are the seen in oral cavity. And non-healing extraction of sockets and oroantral fistula may be the other manifestation. We have to suspect vagus granulomatosis. And the patient frequently develop conductive and sensory neural hearing loss, either of which can lead to the severe permanent hearing loss, hearing impairment in these patients.
Why do they develop conductive hearing loss?
Sir, due to the blockage of the eustachian tube due to the
Or
involvement of the
that is okay. What else? Previous history of recurrent glue ear. That's very important because when you when a patient goes to the ENT surgeon for a glue ear, it is considered as a benign condition. The ENT people do not bother much about glue ears, and glue ears is fairly common in the younger population. So if a person goes with recurrent glue ears or a previous history of grommet insertion, you know grommet, no? They insert grommet for glue ears, or previous history of recurrent otitis media, they that is what is responsible for conductive hearing loss. Okay, so previous history of recurrent serous otitis media or glue ear and grommet insertion can be taken in the history.
Sir, if a patient with non-healing extracted socket means how many, like at least 6 weeks or 5 weeks or like that, sir? And any period, time period is there, sir, or like non-healing?
No, there's nothing like time period per se. No.
Okay, sir. Coming to the pulmonary involvement, it varies from asymptomatic lung nodules to catastrophic pulmonary hemorrhage. Lung nodules, they may be as a single or multiple, and solid or cavitatory, and fixed or migratory, can mimic lung abscess initially or even a lung cancer in older age patients. It may also, few of the patients may present with ILDs also, interstitial lung disease. Diffuse
ILD is
alveolar.
not common. ILD is not common in vasculitis. See, vasculitis is very aggressive. You don't find ILD like presentation. You could only see pneumonitis, not ILD.
No.
You can find pulmonary pneumonitis or pulmonary vasculitis, but not ILD. You won't get the typical NSIP or UIP here.
Yes, sir.
Because vasculitis, the process is too fast, especially when it happens in the lungs or other organs. Only the ENT things will be very slow, that's all. So ILD, I don't think so.
Okay. Coming to the diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, it is estimated to occur in 5 to 15% of patients with ANCA-associated vasculitis and may be the initial finding. Sir, in Kelly's, they have also mentioned 5 to 45% of the patients with ANCA-associated vasculitis may present with a diffuse alveolar hemorrhage.
Yeah, see, that
45,
depends on
40.
where from where the series is there, no? So if you take a tertiary hospital, say something like PGI Chandigarh, which is known for vasculitis as the vasculitis unit, the type of patients referred there are sick patients. So if you ask PJ Chandigarh as to how many alveolar hemorrhage you see in a year, their numbers will be high. The same thing when you come to a soft center, you go to a rheumatology practice. Say, for example, somebody's got a rheumatology clinic and you ask them how many alveolar hemorrhages you see there, it will be very less. So all these statistics depend on where the statistics are taken from. So there is always a referral bias when it comes to statistics. That's why if you see he has written 5 to 15%. That sounds more reasonable. I don't think we'll see 45% of patients having diffuse alveolar hemorrhage. I mean, me and Dharmanand, if you ask us, once in 2 years we see one alveolar hemorrhage.
True.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes,
Go
sir.
on.
Coming to the renal, the most sinister presentation is the form of rapidly progressive renal failure characterized by oliguria, microscopic hematuria, RBC CAS, and rapid rise in the creatinine. The biopsy shows a pauci-immune crescentic glomerulonephritis. These are the renal presentation, whereas
So
the
the most
eye
important here is the pauci-immune. Unlike
pauci-immune.
lupus nephritis, where there's a full house immunofluorescence positivity, here this is pauci-immune. Ravi,
Coming to the eye,
one more thing you had to add when you were talking about airways. You said about laryngeal stenosis, subglottic stenosis. It's not only subglottic stenosis; we also see bronchial stenosis. It's not unusual. Okay, so
okay,
it
sir.
doesn't have to be always only laryngeal stenosis. It can be even bronchial stenosis.
Okay, okay, sir.
Just suddenly I remembered. That's why too.
Coming to the eye manifestations in vagus, it may present with necrotizing scleritis, peripheral ulcerative keratitis, and orbital pseudotumor. Scleritis begins with pain and redness and eventually causes scleromalacia, perforance, and loss of vision. Whereas the orbital pseudotumor-like presentation can cause proptosis, pain, and vision loss, usually refractory to therapy. Risk of blindness reported to be 50% despite of the aggressive treatment we have given in orbital
So
pseudotumor.
we have to remember that many a times eye may be the only presentation, and we've had quite a few referrals from all the eye institutes of patients who have persistent scleritis not responding to conventional drops. And when you do a urine examination and a creatinine, you find that they have proteinuria or hematuria or whatever. So necrotizing scleritis hardly happens in non-rheumatological regions unless you have pyogenic infection, and that they can easily make out. They can't miss it. So if an ophthalmologist says necrotizing inflammation, it can happen only in 3 instances, particularly when it comes to us. One is Wegener's, the other one being an uncontrolled rheumatoid, scleromalacia perforans, and the third one is relapsing polychondritis, and the fourth one is very bad Sjogren's with severe Zika can have necrotizing scleritis. So these are the so whenever you see necrotizing scleritis, it's very suggestive. The other one that you said was peripheral ulcerative keratitis. This also usually is very typical of an autoimmune etiology. What is peripheral ulcerative keratitis? What do you mean by that? Where is the lesion?
Sir, in the conjunctiva.
Keratitis. Where is the lesion? When you use the word keratitis, where is the lesion?
It's cornea only. It's cornea only, sir.
Cornea. So it is cornea. If you take the round of the cornea, it is at the limbus. The junction where the cornea meets the conjunctiva is called the limbus. At the limbus, if you see small ulcerations, it's nearly always suggestive of an autoimmune etiology. So if you speak to the eye specialist, they'll tell you. The moment they say PUK, immediately they will send the patient to us, saying that this is autoimmune. Even though we do ANCA, we do ANA, everything comes negative. We tell them we don't find anything systemic. They will say keep a watch because PUK is very suggestive.
This is the oral presentation with what we have to do is the orbital pseudotumor routine inspection or with the measurement tools we can find we have to find CT or MRI, and GPA more and microscopic polyangiitis may present with sensorineural hearing loss, and audiography is mostly we have to order and Sinonasal inflammation we can see by otoscope or fibro-optic examination. Subglottic stenosis, subglottic inflammation, we can go for the laryngoscopy.
Can you do anything else? Why only laryngoscopy is invasive? You can take a good CT scan of the airways, inspiratory and expiratory.
That's called. That is also called what we can do a virtual bronchoscopy with a CT scan. Like what Ramesh told, inspiration, expiration they can do a virtual bronchoscopy. They can see the stenosis also.
Because what happens is invasive laryngoscopy and all is difficult. So to make a quick diagnosis, in fact, the first step is not bronchoscopy. The first step is when somebody comes to you with a stridor, is obviously you do an ENT examination, but the ENT person can only see till the vocal cords. Beyond the vocal cords, they cannot see. So you will always ask for CT scan of the airways, inspiration and expiration, so that it will take you right through subglottic area into the tracheobronchial tree. So you will even know tracheal stenosis and bronchial stenosis through that. Okay. Then when you want a biopsy, or if it is too critical where you need intervention, then you will need a laryngoscopy.
Right.
Many a times when you do a laryngoscope or a bronchoscope, you may not be able to pass the scope beyond the area, and the area will be extremely friable. It might even bleed when they put the scope. So you have to be very careful. You need a proper center where they know what to do. So they will go very smoothly, and then they will take a biopsy from the wall. And sometimes, and especially always remember, with all vasculitic lesions, the tissue is extremely friable. Okay, the tissue is, because it is very vascular. So when you ask the pulmonologist or an ENT person to take a biopsy, when they touch it, it could bleed. The same way in the ENT, when you ask the ENT people to do a nasal endoscopy, ask them to do a nasal endoscopy and ask them to very carefully take a biopsy via the nasal endoscope. Because many a times what happens in their rush, they don't bother about doing endoscopy. They just put the whatever that instrument they call it, forceps into the nose and pull out an inflammatory tissue with great confidence. And that is always a cause for complete collapse of the bridge of the nose. Many a times I've seen patients saying that after the biopsy, my bridge of the nose collapsed. So the tissues are extremely friable. So that's why the best way first is to go for a CT scan. The same way when you look at the ENT also, always go for a CT scan before you do invasive things. Because a CT scan, it might only tell you about sinusitis, but it will also tell you about destruction. It might tell you destruction of the sinuses, destruction of the nasal septum, ethmoidal plate, if there is any extension cranially into the cerebrum, if there is anything inflammatory tissue extending. So the best, they say, to know the bony architecture, CT is best. So when it comes to imaging, if you ask me, shall I do MRI of the nasal sinuses or should I do CT of the nasal sinuses? The ENT people will always ask for CT, because the bony architecture is better seen on a CT compared to an MRI. So go back to that slide. Yeah. So what else was there?
The pulmonary nodules that we can do by CT of the chest and cavitatory lesions to see. And if we want any biopsy, we can take by the transbronchial, all the three diagnostic features are said. And
need not be
patient
always transbronchial. It can be a CT guided biopsy if the lesion is peripheral.
peripheral.
Yeah.
In alveolar hemorrhage, if patient is more severe, then when we are intubating, that time also we can see the blood in the, when we are intubating, that is also one of the clinical finding we can do. And CT of the chest is also one of the imaging
How
diagnosis.
diagnostic is CT chest for alveolar hemorrhage?
Sir?
How diagnostic or how useful is CT chest for alveolar hemorrhage? Anybody? Is CT chest enough to make a diagnosis of alveolar hemorrhage?
No, sir.
So what you see basically is only alveolar consolidation. on CT chest. So CT chest will not be able to differentiate between extensive inflammation, extensive infection versus inflammation. So when you do a bronchoscopy, you have to ask for a bronchial wash. And when you ask for a bronchial wash, ideally it should be a 3-level wash. That is the upper part, the middle part, and the lower part. Ask them as they go with the bronchoscope, ask them to take the material 3 times in different pots. Pot 1, pot 2, pot 3. Why do we do that? Why should we take 3 specimens? Why should you ask the pulmonologist to take 3 specimens instead of 1? They can easily, when they do bronchial wash, they can take 1. No, why should you do 3?
So
Say again. No. So if you find blood in the first specimen, which is the topmost, and you don't find blood in the bottommost, what does that indicate?
it may be due to the trauma.
Exactly. It could be due to trauma from the procedure. Okay. So you should find blood in all the 3 specimens. Okay. And merely finding only blood is not enough because it could still be traumatic. So what will you ask the pathologist to do on the specimen? Tanmay? Yes, you will do a Prussian blue stain to look for it's not blood laden. What does Prussian blue identify? Hemosiderin.
Hemosiderin.
It's for hemosiderin laden macrophages. That's what you're going to look for. Say, for example, a patient has come to the casualty breathless. They're intubating him. There's, widespread opacities. And the patient has become breathless for the last 4 hours. And you think it is alveolar hemorrhage and you send the specimen. You don't find it. But clinically, you're strongly thinking this is alveolar hemorrhage because his ANCA is strongly positive. Can that happen? If so, why? Anyone?
It takes time for the development of hemosiderin-laden macrophages. I think the macrophages has to engulf the blood, and that's
Yes.
what is seen.
What is that time?
Sir?
What is that time? How much time?
Not very sure, sir. 4 hours.
It's usually 24 to 48 hours. Okay, so to find hemosiderin-laden macrophages, sometimes it might take up to 24 to 48 hours. Then you also have to remember that when alveolar hemorrhage happens, it could be microhemorrhages to begin with. So the very first time when you do it, even though the clinical episode that the patient becomes breathless, when things are very bad, you could still find it because the process would have started before the patient became symptomatic. But if you did not find it, don't assume that it is not there. That's the message. Because you can still have alveolar hemorrhage without the presence of hemosiderin-laden macrophages. But if you find hemosiderin-laden macrophages, it is very diagnostic.
So peripheral small microbleeds will not have it, no?
Yeah, no. You have to have a proper central bleed. So in vasculitis, like, Tanmay knows Shailaja Acharya, who used to have a chronic symptoms for a long time. She had chronic diffuse alveolar hemorrhage. So it never used to be big ones. It used to be micro bleeds, always small bleeds. So she would come with epistaxis once in a while here and there. She had pulmonary shadows, which was mistaken for ILD. But it was not ILD. I was not convinced that it was ILD. And then once we did a bronchoscopy and a wash and a biopsy, that actually showed classical pulmonary hemosiderin-laden macrophages, suggestive of a chronic DAH. So what I'm trying to tell you, there is this entity called chronic DAH, which you also see occasionally. Okay, so just be careful about DAH. Need not be always that massive thing what you see, and CT scan is never a diagnostic. Go on.
For the digital ischemias, we can by inspection we can examine, and angiography is one of the imaging that we can go. And peripheral neuropathy, neurological examination whether to see for any sensory or motor neuropathy, and we can order for the neuroconduction studies and EMGs. Nephritis, we can go for the urine sediments and RBC cas are the one we can do it.
One
And,
thing always don't forget that whenever you see digital ischemia, very carefully look for neuropathy. Usually they go hand in hand. A lot of people with digital ischemias, splinter hemorrhages, or vasculitic lesions will have mononeuritis multiplex. It's a very common symptom. So very careful. You should very carefully examine for mononeuritis multiplex. And neuropathy, what you get is mononeuritis multiplex. You don't get the classical peripheral sensory neuropathy like how you see in lupus, Sjogren's and other diseases. In vasculitis, it is invariably mononeuritis multiplex.
yes, sir.
And patient need not have always foot drop or a wrist drop. Even a subtle sensory changes in the ulnar distribution, median nerve distribution, or a foot, one half of the foot, that can be a clue.
Ulnar clawing is easily missed. All these claw hands, no? Because especially when they have coexistent arthritis, we usually miss. So just beware, because mild clawing may be there, but sensory changes may be more profound, as Dr. Dharmanand said.
Yes, sir. Next is a microscopic polyangiitis.
Just before you, sorry Ravi, just before you
Yes, sir.
go to microscopic polyangiitis, always remember with GPA, it is notorious to present in unusual places. Okay, what Ravi has told you is the usual presentation. The GPA can virtually come anywhere else also, unusual places. So that's why when you say, when do you look for vasculitis? We always say, look for vasculitis when there is recurrent or persistent symptom in an organ which is not explained by anything else. Like for example, we have seen vasculitis presenting in the breast as a breast lump, as mastitis, granulomatous mastitis. Then I have seen vasculitis presenting in the pituitary as diabetes insipidus. In fact, we had published that case also. So, or it could present as GI bleed, okay, with GI manifestation. So it could be weird sometimes. So these are obviously, I know they're difficult, but just keep in mind that Wegener's can be very weird in presentation sometimes.
Okay. Next is the microscopic polyangiitis. It is defined as a necrotizing vasculitis involving small and occasionally medium vessel arteries also involved. Is a necrotizing glomerulonephritis is very common, and pulmonary capillaries often occurs in these patients, and granulomatous inflammation is absent in my MPA. And coming to the clinical features, constitutional symptoms are common at the diagnosis of Most of them are presented with fever, weight loss. 80% of presented with renal involvement. Rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis can be a presenting feature in 80% of MPA. Pulmonary involvement can be catastrophic in the form of the alveolar hemorrhage seen in 10% of patients and has a poor prognosis. Most of the patients with pulmonary hemorrhage have coexisting glomerulonephritis. Pulmonary fibrosis is seen in about 1/3 of the patients. Coming to the neurological, they may present with mononeuritis multiplex, which is observed in the majority of the patients at the diagnosis of MPN. Axonal sensory motor neuropathy and cranial nerve involvement has also been documented in few of the patients, and cutaneous and ocular involvement, ocular presented as scleritis also seen in few of the patients with MPN.
So Ravi, before you go to EGPA, you said that Wegener's is a granulomatous type and this is a non-granulomatous type. So on a renal biopsy in Wegener's, will you see granulomas?
Yes, sir.
A renal biopsy in a Wegener's patient. Do you see granulomas?
Yes, sir.
Do you?
Yes, sir.
Anybody else who do want to differ?
No, sir. We don't see granuloma.
Why? Supposed to be a granulomatous angiitis, no?
Yes, sir, but in renal kidney we don't see, but in the lungs and that part we usually see. That's why we the choice of biopsy is from lungs, not from the.
Not necessary. If the patient doesn't have lung involvement and has only renal disease, obviously you go for the kidney. The choice of biopsy is based on the system that is affected. Number one, the ease of biopsy. Like, a patient has come to you with renal pulmonary nerve. Then I would go for the nerve. Why would I bother? Or if I want to prognosticate, I might go for the kidney. Lung will be my last biopsy. Because for two reasons, lung biopsies are more difficult. The yield is very less. When you go for a CT guided biopsy, they might just come out with the subcutaneous fat. So a proper biopsy is usually in the nerve or it is in the kidney. Lung and ENT biopsies, the yield is not great. So given of all the sites where I can take a biopsy, and if there is clinical involvement, I would go for either the kidney or I would go for the nerve if those two systems are involved. There are there are two types of manifestation in Wegener's. One is called the granulomatous manifestation, the other is called the vasculitic manifestation. And what happens in the kidney is a vasculitic manifestation. So that's why you don't see granulomas on kidney biopsy. You only see crescentric, pauciimmune, glomerulonephritis. Whereas when you take the lung, in the lung also there are two types. When you look at the airways, you will definitely see granulomatous inflammation. If you see a granuloma or a solid-like mass or a cavity, you could find granuloma. Whereas if you see pulmonary vasculitis, a consolidation, or alveolar hemorrhage, you might see only vasculitis. So beware, just don't be under the assumption that a biopsy from the lung should always show granuloma. It may not actually. The typical sites for granuloma are mainly the ENT areas, and when meningitis happens, granulomatous meningitis is very common. When there is a cranial spread from the ENT area. So those you will see. Whereas peripheral neuropathy, you will not find any granulomas. It's once again a vasculitic manifestation. In the gut, whenever there is inflammation, you will not find granulomas. It's a vasculitic manifestation. So that's why there are two types. One is the granulomatous manifestation, the other is the vasculitic manifestation. So that is very important because that may also have bearing on therapy, because granulomatous granulomatous manifestations are more difficult to control in terms of treatment, whereas vasculitic manifestations are easier. They respond better to cyclophosphamide and rituximab, whereas granulomatous are more grumbling, more difficult to control, and will keep on relapsing. That's the difference between the two.
So the moral of the story is there need not be a granulomatous vasculitis on histopathology all the time, and your diagnosis based on the clinical features rather than the histopathology alone.
Yeah, the histopathology adds up, but don't discount a diagnosis of Wegener's if you don't find granuloma. That's what I'm trying to say.
This is true for Churg-Strauss also.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Eosinophilic granulomatous with polyangiitis. It is also previously known as Churg-Strauss syndrome. It is a necrotizing vasculitis. Most characteristic manifestations such as asthma, eosinophilia. ANCAs mainly anti-MPO are positive and detected in 30 to 40%
characteristic
of
manifestation, Ravi. There
Yes,
will
sir.
be a previous history of asthma or reactive airway disease. So if you ask the patient could have been an asthmatic before or labeled as asthma, or they could have had previous history of seasonal exacerbation of a reactive airway disease like a winter bronchitis. You ask them last few years, every winter I used to get wheezing. You ask them, do you have asthma? They'll say no. But last few years I would have got episodes
Seasonal.
of wheezing, and I had used inhalers. That's all. So
Yes.
there is a previous history of reactive airway disease. Doesn't have necessarily have to be asthma all the time.
Okay, sir. ANCAs mainly anti-MPO detected in 30 to 40% of the patients. Recent studies suggest an association of HLA, DRB4 and severe asthma, sinusitis and nasal polyposis and eosinophils, which may help in early identification of the disease. Potential triggers and precipitating factors are inhaled allergens and desensitization, and drugs like macrolides, carbamazepine, and quinine. These are the potential triggers that may aggravate this. There are the three prototypical successive phases. One is the prodromal, second phase, and late phase. Prodromal phase, which begins with asthma and allergic manifestations like seasonal allergens, and the second phase is a blood eosinophilia more than 10% and tissue eosinophilia affecting visceral organs, mostly lungs. And the last stage is the vasculitic features involving more than 2 extrapulmonary organs, skin and peripheral nerves. Lung infiltrates, which would be the predominantly eosinophilic, and alveolar hemorrhage and nodules are also seen rarely in eosinophilic granulomatous polyangiitis. Coming to the cutaneous, which is seen in 30 to 75% of patients, mainly palpable purpura and urticarial lesions. Mononeuritis multiplex with asymmetrical motor and sensory sign is the most frequent and characteristic feature in Church-Strauss. And most commonly involved nerves are peroneal tibial branch of the sciatica and ulnar and median nerve are the most commonly involved nerves in this. Coming to the cardiac manifestation, 10 to 15% of 50% of the patient may present with cardiac manifestations. Eosinophilic or
See, that's the
granulomatous.
most stop. I think you should not just read off the most important thing is cardiac here. You should highlight that, because if you remember, all of you, all the other vasculitis, he never said anything about the heart.
Cardiac.
The
This.
speciality about EGPA is cardiac involvement. So myocarditis is an exclusive feature of EGPA, which you don't see in Wegener's or microscopic polyangiitis. And asymptomatic carditis may be a feature. So that's why cardiac screening is important when you see a patient of EGPA.
Yes, sir. Cardiomyopathy has been associated with increased mortality in earlier series of eosinophilic granulomatous requiring aggressive treatment. Eosinophilic pericardial effusion is frequent in 20% of the patients. Coming to the renal, focal segmental and pauciimmune glomerulonephritis are seen.
No, I don't think so. EGPA, you don't get much of kidney involvement at all. I think you've generalized it. You don't get pauciimmune glomerulonephritis in EGPA. One of the things about EGPA is non-involvement of the kidneys. Just recheck this.
Yes, I'll check this. And coming to the eye, it may present as a uveitis, episcleritis, or retinal vasculitis.
Retinal vasculitis can be a presentation of even Wegener's. You can get it even in GPA also.
Yes. ANCA positivity patients tend to have higher frequency of renal involvement, constitutional symptoms, purpura, alveolar hemorrhage, and mononeuritis multiplex. Whereas the ANCA negative patients mostly cardiomyopathy, pericarditis, levodoreticularis, and pulmonary infiltrates are the most type of presentation. This is a classification criteria for 1990. In this total, six classification principal features are there. In this, mostly first one is the asthma, and greater than 10% of eosinophils on a differential count, and mononeuropathy or polyneuropathy, and migratory or transient pulmonary opacities on radiography, and paranasal sinus abnormalities, and biopsy containing a blood vessel showing the accumulation of eosinophil in extravascular areas. Out of these 6 criteria, presence of 4 will fit into the Church-Strauss syndrome with a sensitivity of 85% and specificity of 99.7%.
Ravi, the other important thing about your chronic allergies are history of nasal polyps, recurrent history of nasal polyps. That's very important in EGPA. Because there is a lot of allergies in the past, nasal allergies or chronic rhinitis, patients can have recurrent nasal polyps. Like how you have recurrent serous otitis in Wegener's, recurrent nasal polyposis in EGPA.
He had mentioned it.
Is it? Polyps?
Yeah, polyp I mentioned.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah, as Ramesh was telling about Wegener's granulomatosis or GPA, the difference between granulomatous component and vasculitic component. EGPA also is somewhat typical. There are 2 entities. One is vasculitis dominant entity and eosinophilic infiltrate dominant entity, which can sometimes mimic hypereosinophilic type of syndromes. So sometimes there is an overlap between these two. So people with hypereosinophilia, tissue infiltration are more likely to have cardiac and other organ involvements. That vasculitis is typical of any other ANCA-associated vasculitis. So these are slightly overlapping area. Some people want to separate this out because they think that they may not be same entities. Okay, go.
Yes. There is another criteria, Lanman criteria, which confirms asthma and peripheral blood eosinophilia in excess of 1500 cells per microliter and systemic vasculitis involving 2 or more extrapulmonary organs. All of these 3 criteria must be present to diagnose as a EGA according to the Lanham criteria.
So Ravi, I'll give you a clinical situation. Okay. You have a
Okay.
patient who has presented with cutaneous vasculitis. Okay.
Okay.
They have numbness. Okay. In the in the peroneal nerve territory in one foot. And there is some proteinuria. Okay. In the kidney. Okay. So there is proper vasculitic rash in both the legs. There is one common peroneal neuropathy. And there is proteinuria as well as a hematuria on urine examination. The ANCA is negative. Okay. Which area would you like to biopsy now? You have skin, you have kidney, you have nerve.
Sir, I'll go for the nerve only, sir. Easily access.
Well, skin is also easily accessible.
Yes,
Why
sir,
will you not
cutaneous.
go for the skin? Why will you not go for the skin?
Sir, cutaneous.
So in this patient, skin may give you the diagnosis as vasculitis because ANCA is negative. All you need to know is it's vasculitis. But then skin, you
Cutaneous.
look at the rash, you know it's vasculitis. You don't need a biopsy, right? What you need is a kidney because kidney will prognosticate the future of the person. Okay. So sometimes when you do a renal biopsy, you will see that you have quasi-immune crescentic glomerulonephritis, and if you are able to take out 20 glomeruli, 10 of them may already be sclerosed. So this will prognosticate renal disease. That is the importance of doing a renal biopsy. Renal biopsy is not only diagnostic, but it's also important to prognosticate. Say, for example, you had a similar patient who didn't have kidney disease, who had only skin and who had some nerve symptoms. ANCA is negative.
Sir, in this patient, I go for the skin biopsy, sir.
So
Cutaneous.
I would always keep skin as the last because skin biopsy is not a diagnostic test. It will not tell you the etiology of vasculitis. It only tells you that it is vasculitis. Okay. You can't make a diagnosis. In which condition can skin biopsy be diagnostic of the underlying disease? Vasculitis, I mean. In which type of vasculitis can skin biopsy be diagnostic? You don't need any other biopsy except skin biopsy. There's only one vasculitis. Why? Will you see Kraglov?
Okay, no, how can you?
You don't see Kraglov.
But the one clue I will give you: you have to do two different examinations,
HSP,
but in the
sir.
biopsy only.
Exactly, HSP. So an immunofluorescence on the skin biopsy, okay, for IgA deposits. That is the only situation where skin biopsy will be useful. That is when you're thinking of a HSP like disease. Whereas in other instances, skin may not be useful to you. I would always go for kidney if possible. If the patient is clinically well, because it gives me prognostication. If kidney is not possible, then I'll go for nerve biopsy to make a diagnosis. And then last will be lung or ENT or others. It's the order.
When you don't have any other tissue to biopsy, a lot of systemic symptoms and only skin lesions are there, your ANCA is negative. The skin lesions will give us some confidence in using medications, though it doesn't tell us what vasculitis it is. It can be still a carcinomatous malignancy related vasculitis, but it's very, very non-specific. Skin can react in only one or two ways. So either it has to be palpable purpura or an urticarial type of lesion. So that's a small vessel vasculitis. If it is a medium vessel vasculitis, you will have an ulcer or a nodule or a deep dermal infarct. So that can give us some kind of a visual impression about what kind of vasculitis may be dominant. If you have only purpura and urticaria, the patient is more likely to have small vessel vasculitis. If you have an ulcer or a nodular lesions or a deep dermal infarct, like a stellate star like lesions or an infarct, skin infarct, then
Skin
it's more like
necrosis, basically.
skin
Deep
necrosis or
dermal
an
is skin
infarct.
necrosis.
Yes, then that it indicates a medium vessel vasculitis. Then you should look for a pan like vasculitis.
The other thing, Ravi, when we were talking about ANCA positivity, you said ANCA in GPA in the ANCA slide, you said that it can be negative in 15% of the patients. PR3. Always remember that's not the figure. If a patient has limited Wegener's, that is something restricted only to the eye, only to the ENT, nowhere else, 80% of the times ANCA can be negative.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So ANCA positivity is more common in generalized disease than limited disease. So if you have limited disease, it can always be negative. Okay. So don't go by ANCA negativity when you see only one single organ involvement. What is single organ vasculitis? Has anybody heard this term? Single organ vasculitis.
And one example, if you have heard it, what is the example?
Anyone? No. Single organ vasculitis.
It doesn't affect other organs. Only one organ is affected, and many
See,
times it is
If
curative.
you look at the Chapel classification, if you go to the miscellaneous box, you will see there single organ vasculitis.
CNS, PACS.
What?
Primary CNS angiitis. Primary CNS angiitis.
It is different. It's a different entity altogether.
I'll give you a clue. It is generally seen by surgeons and histopathologists, and it may not come to a rheumatologist at all.
Is it there classification or you've taken it off? I can't see the print. It's too small.
Sir, single organ vasculitis, sir, isolated aorta arteritis, primary central nervous system vasculitis, cutaneous arteritis, and cutaneous
So
leukocytis.
it's there in the miscellaneous, isn't it?
Yes,
It's
sir.
there in the miscellaneous. Single organ. Ever wondered what it was? That's why I asked you. So
Appendicitis.
it only means that usually, sorry, Sahana, you wanted to say something?
So appendicitis, I'm not very sure, but I feel I've read it somewhere. Appendix.
Yeah. You're correct. In a way that you will find vasculitis in only one organ. So the reason what clue Dharmanand gave was when a surgeon operates something, say for example, gallbladder or appendix, he finds vasculitis in it, but the patient doesn't have any evidence of systemic vasculitis. You chop off that organ that has vasculitis, the patient will never manifest with systemic vasculitis again. So there is just limited localized vasculitis to one area in the body, and a surgical excision of which cures almost the vasculitis, and the patient never develops. I've seen one patient with only single renal vasculitis. In one kidney, the presentation was gross hematuria. That is, he used to just bleed from the kidney. This was in Norwich, David Scott's patient. He would just bleed profusely from the kidneys. So, they finally had to do a nephrectomy. So one it was taken off, and on histopathology it was shown as a vasculitis. Once that patient, then he was referred to rheumatology for follow-up. We did all the tests, everything was normal. We followed up the patient for years, nothing happened actually. So that one kidney being taken off was the cure for the disease.
And we have seen a lot of patients from when I was in Manipal, because surgeons used to remove gangrenes and other GI gangrenes, and as Ramesh was telling, gallbladder, sometimes appendix. That will show vasculitis. Because it showed vasculitis, patients sometimes gets referred to us, but we don't find anything else. Most of the time, it is a medium-sized vasculitis, like kind of a pan variant. It is maybe a localized pan in a GI tract. That is usually referred to as single organ vasculitis, and a single region vasculitis can be isolated aortoarteritis and CNS vasculitis. If you want to do a minor terminological play.
Good. Anybody wants to ask anything till here, till the clinical features or investigation? If we are clear, then we'll close.
Close. Tired. Allah tired. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for attending.
Yes,
And when is Tanmay talking? Other apart? Saturday?
Saturday we'll do it because anyway we don't have Dr. Dinesh Khanna's.
Saturday? Okay. There's something else on Sunday, no?
That's Sunday morning around Dr. Ramanan.
Raman. Yeah.
So Saturday evening we have time. So let's do it.
Okay. See you all. Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you, sir.